Okay, so where was I? Oh, attendance. Okay, so I was getting some emails already this week about attendance, and that's awesome that you're being proactive about attendance. But here's what I want you to understand. The new policy about attendance is as such. So when you have Google Meets with your teachers, regardless of whether it's this class or another class, if you are at the meeting, you will get marked as being present. If you are not at the meeting, you will get marked as being absent. So a lot of parents and students are already emailing teachers and saying, well, I've got a doctor's appointment. I don't want my kid to have an unexcused absence or blah, 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 blah. And understand that attendance is not tied to your grade. So if you are absent from the Google Meet, it's not like you're going to get a certain percent docked off your grade for not being there, okay? It's more of just a data point for teachers and administration so that they can understand who was there and who was not, because that can kind of help them out. And it's kind of a welfare check, so to speak, so we can make sure that everybody's doing okay. Like if we've got a student that has been there for a number of weeks and then all of a sudden they're off the grid and we haven't seen them, then this is a good data point to kind of help that out. Okay, so we already played Quizlet Live. I'm gonna try to see if I can find a way for you to give me some feedback if that actually helped or not, or whatever. Next, I'm going to introduce the American Revolution. This is going to be a mini lecture of epic proportion. You've never seen a lecture this short here because a lot of the stuff you already know, but we want to make sure that we review a couple of different things in this. Then I'm going to introduce the History Alive guided notes. So you'll have a couple of PDFs. One you'll put into Notability and the other one you will just do a reading on. It's going to kind of act as a metaphor. Then I'm going to make sure that you know where the new terms are for Thursday, Friday of next week, because that is, so 1 week from today, no, not 1 week from today. It'll be 1 week from last Wednesday, or excuse me, just 1 week from yesterday, okay? In which you have that, that new terms quiz coming up. And then your term quiz / bigger chunks quiz is coming up here, okay? So big idea that I want you to understand has a lot to do with that foreign policy thing that we just talked about, okay? Remember how we were talking about imperialism. Imperialism is a lot like colonialism, and colonists were growing angry at British rule because they didn't feel like they had the same rights as people living in England. They didn't have representation. They didn't have a voice in government. And when it came to being taxed, they were really upset about that, okay? And what I also want you to understand is that in this time period, there's a notion of something that we talked about back in US History A, if you had my class, and that is deference. Deference is the idea that people are born of a noble status or they're born of a not so noble status. I'm sure you've seen in like older movies, like when a colonist was walking down the street and witnessed somebody of nobility, they had to bow and take off their hat and show that they were of a more noble status. And that kind of adds into this whole relationship that I want you to understand. Colonists were upset about the notion that they weren't getting treated with that same type of deference. So this notion of freedom is something that really kind of fuels this fire. So the trouble starts, then we see the fighting, then we see the Declaration of Independence. And how did we get to that step? Okay, well, it largely has to do with this power and control. Okay, power and control. Independence is what they were going for with the American Revolution, but it largely had to do with that control coming from England, okay? So first in 1765, we're going to see the Stamp Act, which is largely having to do with taxing, okay? Then you're going to see the Boston Massacre, which you're going to learn a little something about today, or actually in the reading as we go forward, not necessarily today, but in, and this was more of a piece of propaganda. You've probably seen the painting by Paul Revere about the Boston Massacre, you know, showing how vicious the Boston Massacre was. Well, people kind of read that article and looked at that painting thinking that hundreds of people had been shot, when in actuality it was only about 5. Okay, the Boston Tea Party was the rejection of that, of only given one option of tea for them to buy. It was actually cheaper for them to buy this tea, but they were upset about the fact that they didn't have that option. Okay, and little known fact is that that tea came from the East India Tea Company because the British also had a colony in India. Okay, 1774, you see the first Continental Congress where all of these states were coming together to try to decide how they were going to deal with those recent events. The battles at Lexington and Concord are the start of what we would call the American Revolution. And then lastly, you see the Declaration of Independence, which is why we celebrate July 4th. Okay, so just so you have a bearing, just wanted to give you a bearing upon what was going on relative to the things that we're going to study. So here's what I want you to do now. I want everybody to go to Schoology. Okay. And in Schoology, here's a little bit what it's going to look like for you. And I'll just view this as, actually, I should probably pick somebody from this hour, but it shouldn't matter. So take note of your due dates over on the right-hand side here, folks, okay? Today was the due date for that term quiz, Bigger Chunks quiz. You've got that American Revolution term quiz coming up here. You're going to see that Revolution Area War folder is open now, and you can see that you've got a Quizlet link here with pictures and without pictures. I put the no pictures one on there because there's no pictures on the quiz, and some kids said, well, hey, I'd like to not have pictures to lean on when I'm doing the Quizlet so that I can do a little bit better on the quiz. So you've got two links there. Use whichever one works for you. Also under this lecture folder, you're going to see Road to Revolution. If we had the full, 50 minutes, 5 times a week that I had you in class, we would be doing this full-on lecture, but the slides are there for those of you that just want to take a look and learn a little bit farther. So here's what you're going to be doing now, okay? What I want you to do is I want you to open up this History Alive reading and then also take a look at this History Alive Chapter 7 guided notes. Okay, so this one right here, put this in Notability. This reading right here, you're just going to want to have this available. Okay, so I'll give you just about 30 seconds to get that done. Okay, here we go. I am going to read 7.1, 7.2, and 7.3 for you. Then I'm going to show you how to do 7.3, and then you'll have to do the remainder of that on your own before next week, before next Tuesday, okay? Hopefully you'll have it done before class as we meet on Monday, but it will be going into the grade book after Tuesday, okay? So how was the Continental Army able to win a war for independence from Great Britain? Well, here we go. I'll read this quickly and pay attention. When the American War for Independence from Great Britain began in 1775, 15-year-old Joseph Martin was too young to join the Continental Army. But when recruiters returned to his Connecticut village a year later, he was ready to go. The recruiters were looking for volunteers to go to New York, where the British rumored to have 15,000 troops. I did not care if there had been 15 times 15,000, Martin said later. I never spent a thought about numbers. The Americans were invincible, in my opinion. Just 2 days after the Declaration of Independence was signed, Martin was traded his plow for a musket, an early type of rifle. A week later, he arrived in New York City, where he hoped to sniff a little gunpowder. As he recalled, I was now what I had long wished to be, a soldier. I had obtained my heart's desire. It was now my business to prove myself equal to my profession. If Martin had known what lay ahead, he might not have been so pleased about his new profession. The Army in New York was ill-trained, ill-equipped, and just plain ill. Almost the whole regiment was sick, reported a Massachusetts officer in his unit. The British Army, in contrast, was well-trained, well-equipped, and well-supported by the British Navy. Rather than the 15,000 troops Martin had heard of, the British had assembled a force of 25,000 men in New York. More than 400 British ships floated in the harbor. This was the biggest army and the largest fleet the British had ever seen overseas. In the face of such overwhelming force, the Americans should have been easily defeated, but they were not. In this chapter, where you learn to read how soldiers like Joseph Martin stood up to the mighty Great Britain and a successful revolution that created a new nation. So that's 7.1. I'm going to read 7.2 and 7.3 for you and then show you how to complete it. Here we go. This side is talking about the strengths, okay, of the Americans and, the American strengths and weaknesses. I don't like how that's cutting out, but here, let's try this, shall we? I'll download it and open it up. There, hopefully that's a little bit better. Can everybody still see this?
I can only see you. I can't see your screen.
Oh, well, shoot. That's no good. Shoot, I wish I would have asked that earlier. Does everybody, that's embarrassing. Does everybody know where we are and everybody knows what we're looking at right now? Are we good? Okay. All right, so here we go. We're going to read these two, and then I'm going to show you how to complete the other part. So the Patriots were in a weak position when the American Revolution began. They were a hastily organized, untrained army with a small navy. Their weaknesses were far more obvious than their strengths. So here we go. First, the American strengths. The Continental Army was always short of men. General George Washington had more than 20,000 troops at one time in one place. Many soldiers enlisted for 6 months or a year. When they were just learning how to fight, they would pick up their muskets and go home to take care of their farms and families. So they were militia. They were not like a regular army. Few Americans were trained for battle. Some were hunters and could shoot well enough from behind a tree. But when facing a mass of the well-disciplined redcoats, they were likely to turn and run. The army was plagued by shortages. Guns and gunpowder were so scarce that Benjamin Franklin suggested arming the troops with bows and arrows. Food shortages forced soldiers to beg for handouts. Uniforms were scarce as well. In winter, one could track shoeless soldiers by their bloody footprints in the snow. Wowee. Such shortages outraged Washington, but when he complained to the Second Continental Congress, nothing changed. Congress, with the nation's only government, lacked the power to raise enough money by taxing the colonies, now the new nation states. In desperation, Congress printed paper money to pay for the war. But the value of war dropped so low that the merchants demanding to be paid in gold instead. Like everything else, gold was scarce. American strengths. Still, the Americans did have strengths. One was the patriotism and people like Joseph Martin, who willingly gave their lives to defend the ideal of a country based on liberty and democracy. Without them, the war would have been quickly lost. The Americans also received help from overseas. Motivated by their old hatred of the English, the French secretly aided the Americans. During the first 2 years of the war, 90% of the Americans' gunpowder came from Europe, mostly from France. In addition, a Polish Jew named Chaim Solomon, who immigrated to New York in 1775, helped finance the war effort. The Americans' other great strength was their commander. General Washington was more than an experienced military leader. He was also a man who inspired courage and confidence. In the dark days to come, it was Washington who would keep the ragtag Continental Army together. Okay, so on this side, we've got the ragtag Continental Army. They're not regular soldiers. Remember, these were all farmers and hunters and artisans. They weren't soldiers by trade. On this side, we're gonna have the British, who were raised from birth, okay, trained from birth to be soldiers. So here we go. In contrast to the American colonies, Great Britain entered the war from a position of strength. Yet, despite both the real and perceived advantages, the British forces encountered many problems. British strengths. With a professional army of about 42,000 troops at the beginning of the war, British forces greatly outnumbered the Continental Army. In addition, George III hired 30,000 mercenaries from Germany. These hired soldiers were known as Hessians because they came from a part of Germany called Hesse-Kassel. The British were also able to recruit many loyalists, African Americans and American Indians to fight on their side. British and Hessian troops were well trained in European military tactics. They excelled in large battles and fought by a mass of troops in open ground. They also had far more experience in firing artillery than Americans had. The British forces were well supplied as well. Unlike the pitifully equipped Continental Army, they seldom lacked for food, uniforms, weapons, or ammunition. Okay, here we go. British weaknesses. Even so, the war presented Great Britain with huge problems. One was the distance between Great Britain and America. Sending troops and supplies across the Atlantic was slow and costly. News of battles arrived in England long after they had occurred, making it difficult for British leaders to plan a course of action. A second problem was that King George and his ministers were never able to convince the British people that defeating the rebels was vital to the future of Great Britain. The longer the war dragged on, the less happy the British taxpayers became about paying its heavy costs. The third problem was poor leadership. Lord George Germain, the man chosen to direct the British troops, had no real sense of how to defeat the rebels. How could he? He had never set foot in North America, nor did it occur to him to go see for himself what his army was up against. If he had, Germain might have realized that this was not a war that could be won by conquering a city or two. To end the revolution, Germain's forces would have to crush the Patriots' will to fight state by state. Instead, Germain kept changing plans and generals, hoping for some combination of the two would bring him an easy victory. So, back to this, the one that you put into notability. So your chapter 7 guided notes. Okay, here's what we're looking for. We are going to use a metaphor to explain what we just described in 7.3. Okay, so do we have any strengths of the British to start the war? Okay, strengths of the British to start the war. Could anybody tell me of a strength?
They had way more troops than the Americans.
They had way more troops. Okay, and not only did they have more, but what else was better about them?
They were better equipped.
They were better equipped. Yep. And what other advantages?
Better trained.
They were better trained. Awesome. Okay. How about weaknesses of the British to start the war? Weaknesses.
They had poor leadership.
Poor leadership. Yep. Okay, so obviously a strength for the Americans was Washington, but the leadership for the British wasn't as good. I mean, and furthermore, they weren't familiar with the area they were, and they also had the king. King George is way the heck over in England. They would send news home, and it would take weeks, and then it would take weeks for that news to get back. Okay, so. Complete the annotations of the map for round 1 for capture the flag. We are going to use a metaphor called capture the flag, okay, to kind of symbolize what we had just read. So the blue team, okay, is smaller. It is not warmed up. It hasn't played capture the flag as much as the red team, okay, just like, who do you think I want you to write here? Who do you think is the blue team?
The Americans.
Yeah, the colonists. Very good. Okay. The red team is larger. It has warmed up. What do you think it means by it has warmed up? It has warmed up. What do you think that might mean? No guesses? They've actually fought in a war before. All of these professional soldiers had been fighting for years and years and years against the French, or been fighting on the outskirts of the English Empire. So maybe they had already been to India, or maybe they had already been to parts of Africa and fought before. Okay, whereas these colonists had not fought before. Okay, it has played capture the flag more than the blue team. Okay, so a lot of these metaphors that we're using here are basically trying to describe the idea that The colonists had never done this before. Okay, but the red team definitely did. It was the most powerful army and the most powerful empire in the world. This game of capture the flag, okay, if they were going to hold like an ESPN preview to it, was going to be over in minutes because the colonists just were a bunch of rookies that had no experience doing this stuff. Okay, so just to give you an idea of how I would like that thing to look, you could look at this example right here. Okay, so you already listed the strengths of the British for me: resources, men, training. They were regular army. Okay, two weaknesses of the British: the distance from their country. And think about, like, if you were a British soldier fighting in the Americas for a bunch of people that didn't want to be a part of your empire, there wasn't much incentive to fight. Okay? The only incentive to you was really to just survive. Whereas the Americans, they kind of had the notion that, well, I want to get through this and I want my independence. Okay. So we said that this side was the Americans, this side was the Redcoats. Okay. The blue team's captain has experience playing capture the flag, just like George Washington. Okay. The white team cheers for the blue team, just like, remember how the French was aiding the Americans, right? Okay, and then half of the red team starts the game far away from the field. Okay, just like the red team. Okay, because the British are going to have to travel to get to this capture the flag game, if that makes any sense. Okay. Any questions about this first page here, 7.3? No? Okay.
No.
All right. So pay attention to Schoology and know that when that is due. Okay. So I gave you a little head start on that. I want you to complete that on your own. Okay. But for the time being, okay, what I want you to do is I'm going to open up that quiz right now. Okay. As soon as you are done with the quiz and you don't have any questions, you can log out for the day and get to, of the Google Meet anyway, you can log out of the Google Meet and you can get to work on, what we just were talking about. Okay. So let me just make sure that I've got this all good to go.
I was just going to say, my students can meet me on Google Hangouts. I'm going to call you in just a minute.
Oh, are you sure? Is that the way?
Is that how you
work
want
for
to do
you?
it, or can you do a breakout session?
I can. I know that I can. We'll see if I can actually do it.
Okay,
One
if
sec.
you're able to do that's great. Then we'll do that. Otherwise, if you can't, then we'll just meet on Google Hangouts.
No, don't worry. Here, let me see if I can do it. The way I've got it now, it's going to put everybody in a room. So I might just, is it okay if can you just do the hangout with them? I'm so sorry about that, Ms. Halverson. I should have.
So
I'm just.
my students, I'm going to call you on Google Hangouts in just a minute, so you can end this call.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that quiz is available. So like I said, once you take that, and you don't have any questions, you can go.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Hey, those of you that are left, I just have a quick question on the over on the comments section here. If you guys just any feedback that you have about did the Quizlet Live help you or not? But I'll shut up and let you guys continue quizzing. Okay.